Welcome back to the Guides Network, brought to you on the Your Lake Fork Guide YouTube channel. Today, Mr. Andrew Grills, Big Fish Killer, is back once again. He's going to break down one of his very favorite techniques. You know, this guy, he lives for nothing but big fish. And today, Andrew's going to talk to you guys a little bit about fishing a jig. Not just a jig. Andrew's kind of known, he's kind of famous for a flipping jig. One thing he's not as known for, but is just as good at, is a football jig. This is going to be the offshore version of how to fish a jig. He's going to show you guys some electronic stuff. He's going to break down what he looks for in offshore areas. So definitely watch the whole video. He's got so much good information here. It's crammed with tons of awesome content. Guarantee you this video will make you a better fisherman. So y'all stay tuned. As always, if you like it, hit that thumbs up. If you want to see more like it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Make sure you tell all your buddies. We appreciate you guys watching the Guides Network, and we'll see y'all next time.
Look at that thing. Little jig fish. Good one. Yeah, man. Football jig, November. Deep structure on Lake Fork. A nice fish. Healthy fish. Good thick brain fish. You want to let it go, Billy? Yeah. Hey guys, Andrew Grills here on Lake Fork. Today I want to talk to you about one of my favorite techniques, and that's fishing a football jig. I throw a football jig most of the year out here. I began throwing it in May, fish it all the way through the summer. I pick it up again in November and fish it November, December quite a bit. It's probably my favorite technique for big fish out here. Today we're using a Sandtone jig. This is a 3/4 ounce Mexican heather color. I tend to like 3/4 ounce better than 1 ounce. It's just my preference. A lot of guys, they're firm believers that 1 ounce gets bigger bites. I catch a lot of big fish on that 3/4. Doesn't get hung up quite as bad, and it's plenty heavy even if it's windy. We're primarily fishing 15 to 25 feet with this thing, so 3/4 ounce, I feel comfortable with it even in the wind. The color, like I said, this is Mexican heather, but I'll use you know, any kind of green color. Watermelon works really good. Green pumpkin works really good. This is just the one we're having to use today. This is a Strike King Rage Craw trailer that we're using today, and I like to match the trailer to the skirt. I like to match the colors. This color here is a summer craw, and it's perfect with this Mexican heather. It's got a little bit of chartreuse on the bottom, matches a little bit of chartreuse in the skirt, but it's just a preference for me to match the trailer. It doesn't hurt anything to do that. I shorten the Rage Craw about a 1/2 inch. I take the first little segment off of it. You could even take the next one off. This could even be a little bit shorter, but this right here is perfect for right now. When the water gets colder, I will switch to a trailer that has less action. A net bait pack-a-chunk is a really good one. A Berkeley chigger craw is another really good one. But right now we're having unseasonably warm weather, and I still like a lot of movement in my jig. When I take this jig out of the pack, the first thing I do is trim the skirt. And I'll take this trailer off here where you can see. The first thing I do when I take a jig out of the pack is trim the skirt. You can see here, this skirt here is trimmed pretty short, just below the hook shank. The The reason I trim a skirt is when this jig comes to a stop, with that shorter skirt, that skirt's going to flare better, and also it's going to make a kind of compact profile. Some guys think, the bigger your bait is, the bigger the fish you catch. Yeah, that's generally true, but with a jig is already a big fish bait, and it's mimicking a crawfish. Most of the time we're trying to mimic crawfish with it, and I don't think they're after lobsters. I think they're after smaller crawfish, and so that's a perfect representation of a smaller crawfish. That's an easy meal for them. It's moving really slow, and when this jig stops, that skirt's going to flare out, and there's something in a largemouth that when they see that, they get mad and they hit it. That's why a lot of our bites, you're moving that jig and you feel it come against a rock. When it stops on something, that's when you get your bite. And back to color for just a second. Black and blue is the most popular jig color there is. It works everywhere all the time, but when I'm fishing a football jig, it's usually during the warmer months up until into December. When I get into December, I transition to a pitching, flipping kind of deal, and I use black and blue almost all the time. But when I'm throwing a football jig, it's usually going to be a green or a brown, watermelon kind of color. The rod that I'm using is a Kistler Helium 3. It's 7 foot 3 inches long. It's a heavy action rod with an extra fast tip. And what that means, extra fast tip, means it's got a pretty stiff tip. And you need that for a jig. You need to drive that hook home. And the reason we need such a stiff rod is, there's a couple reasons. First of all, the jigs we're using, they've got big heavy wire hooks. And it's not quite that easy to drive that hook home. You've got to have that heavy hook here because, as you'll see later, a lot of the fish we catch, they're going to be big. They're going to be the biggest fish you would have in your bag on another lake, and it's kind of an average fish for us. So you've got to have a heavy hook or they're going to straighten it out. Also, the fish we're catching, because they're bigger, they've got a hard mouth, and it takes a lot of pressure to drive that hook home. The reel that I'm using, this is a Shimano Chronarch. This is my favorite jig reel for me personally. It's an older model. They don't sell it anymore, but the newer ones are great too. The gear ratio is 7:0:1. I want a fast ratio on my jig, and you'll hear me talk in a minute about fishing a jig slow. I do like to creep it, and you think, well, why wouldn't you want a slower reel? Well, you're fishing that jig with your rod, dragging it real slow. When a fish hits that jig, if your rod's right here before you're reeling down, you need to take up the slack quick, because they don't hold the jig that long. When they pick up a jig, they're going to feel that lead, they're going to feel that 3/4 ounces or 1 ounce of lead, they're going to spit it back out. So as soon as I feel that tick, I want to crank down a couple times, and bam, I want to hit that fish as fast as I can. As for the line, I'm using Seaguar Invisex. It's a fluorocarbon line. I always use 20 fishing a football jig. A lot of folks think about fishing a little bit lighter line on a football jig, but as I covered before, we're fishing for bigger fish, sometimes heavier cover. You need that 20-pound line, and it's not going to cost you any bites out here. Our water is generally kind of stained anyway. We're not fishing gin clear water. If the water was super clear, yeah, I might would fish 15 on another lake, but out here 20 is just fine. It's not going to hurt you. That covers it for the gear that I use, and now I'll talk to you a little bit about technique and how I fish the jig. When I'm fishing a jig, I'm looking for big fish, and big fish relate to structure more than cover. And what I mean by that, we're talking about elevation changes on the bottom, points, humps, road beds, creek channel bends, a steep ledge, things like that. If there's cover on a spot, that's just a bonus sometimes it's not. If I'm fishing an area that's got a lot of cover, if I'm fishing a point or a creek channel ledge, I'm going to fish the jig slow. I'm going to use that slow retreat. The slower you go, the more bites you get usually. So my slow retreat, when I make that cast, I want to let that jig fall straight to the bottom. Sometimes you'll see, like I engage my reel, but I've got a lot of slack in my line. You'll see guys throw that jig out there and they engage their reel, and what's going to happen, that jig is going to pendulum back towards your boat, and it's going to fall at an angle. And sometimes they'll pick that jig up on the fall, and that's usually when it's falling straight down. So once it hits the bottom, then I'm just going to creep that jig, and I'm just barely moving it. I'm feeling cover on the bottom. You'll rarely see me hop that jig. If I'm shaking my rod tip, like right now, I'm trying to come over a tree branch. Once I feel it come over something, like right there, I'm going to let it fall all the way back down to the bottom. So my main retrieve around heavy cover especially is just a slow drag. Sometimes when I'm in open water, say I'm fishing a point that doesn't have any trees on it, a lot of times that's where those fish are grouped up and they're eating good. If they're on the bottom, if I see them on my Lowrance and they're on the bottom, I'm going to try that slow crawl first. Especially if it's a spot that's got maybe some rock piles, some shell beds, something like that, that's perfect. But if I see those fish suspended just a little bit, a lot of times when they're chasing bait, they're aggressive, they're schooled up, they're biting good, they're going to be up off the bottom just a little bit. So then I'm going to stroke that jig, and that's probably my favorite way to catch them on a jig, because it's fast action. You're hitting that jig hard, stroking it up, and when they hit it, they smash it. What I mean by stroking is I'm popping that jig a few feet off the bottom, and it's going to get that jig in that fish's face. He's never going to get a good look at it. It's moving, and it kind of gets a reaction bite with a jig, and I'll show you right here what I mean by that. Okay, once I get that jig on the bottom, then I'm going to start my stroke retrieve, and I'm going to go pop, pop. I'm going to try to get that line to crack like a whip. When I feel it's hit the bottom again, pop, pop. Hit the bottom again, pop, pop. And I'll do that all the way back to the boat. And what will happen when you go to pop it again, you'll have a fish on. You know, they'll catch it. You may not feel the bite, but you'll pop it right into them, set the hook on your stroke. The downside is you lose some fish doing this because you don't get the best hook set because they're just there. A lot of my biggest football jig fish have been with that stroking retrieve because it gets a reaction bite. And that covers the retrieves. Just keep it pretty simple. I'll try both of those on a spot. If I'm not getting bit one way, I try it the other way. And now I'd like to talk to you about where I fish a jig. What am I looking for? What kind of structure? What I'm looking for on the graph. As I mentioned before, we're talking about big fish, deep structure, main lake points, road beds, humps, river bends, channel bends, ledges, pond dams, things like that, elevation changes. That's what these big fish relate to. Out here on Lake Fork, 15 to 25 feet. That's basically going to be the depth range that we're working. It kind of varies, you know, throughout the year during the seasons, but that's, you know, generally everything we catch is going to be somewhere in that range. So I'm going to use my Navionics. I'm going to watch my map. I'm looking for long main lake points that extend out into the lake. That's my first stop. When I'm going to a lake I don't know, we do that quite a bit, you know, just for fun, go fish other lakes. I want to see those long main lake points. If that main lake point meets a creek channel, a road bed, or some other type of structure, when you've got two in one, that's even better. So when you're studying your map before you go to the lake, or if you're looking on Navionics, that's what you're looking for. You're looking for a couple types of structure in one. That's where you start your search. Sometimes it may just be a point by itself. Sometimes it may just be a hump. But when you've got two together, or even three together, sometimes you'll have a road bed point with a river bend at the end of the point, or channel bend. That's a trifecta. That's perfect. That's a great big fish spot, especially if it levels out at the right depth. When I'm looking at these spots, I want to find a flat spot. That's usually where they feed. Here on Lake Fork, these fish like to get on a flat spot when they're feeding. When I fished falcon last summer, those fish, they want to be on a ledge. You know, it's just different, you know, when you go from lake to lake and you want to look at all of it. But out here, flat spots. If that point flattens out at that 15 to 25 foot range, somewhere on that flat spot, there's probably going to be a school of fish. So that's kind of how I start my search. It's pretty simple. Start with points and then just look for humps, road beds, ledges, things like that at the right depth. And then when I find that spot that I want to look at, I use my Lowrance, I idle, zigzag over the spot until I find the school. Okay, so we just grabbed the point, and as you can see, there's a bunch of fish down there. A lot of small fish and some bigger ones. The important thing about seeing that size on this Lowrance, the bigger fish are going to have that green inside the arch, and that reflects density. I don't pay attention to how long they are, pay attention to how thick they are. And you can tell by looking at your range and the amount of water that fish is in, how much water that arch takes up. If it takes up a foot of water, it's big. Because there's so many fish down there, that tells me the fish are probably going to be aggressive. So I'm not going to throw that jig out there and drag it. I'm going to stroke it and try to get a reaction bite from the biggest fish in the pack. Right here, starting to see a few bass suspended off the bottom, so they're perfect to try to stroke that jig up and get it in their face. What you got, bro?
Yeah.
There she is. That's why we throw a jig on Lake Fork, don't we, Billy?
Yes, sir.
All right, man, so we saw him on the drive.
Yep.
Stroking that football jig took a little bit of work. That fish was there, out of the bite.
About a 7 pounder, 6 and 7.
Yeah, 7.5.
Probably 7 pounder.
Nice fish, healthy fish. Let's let it go.
Let it go.
Well, we sure appreciate you watching the video. I hope you found something useful. If you like the video, hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more, be sure and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching the Lake Fork Guide Network. We'll see y'all later.